Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this episode of our Towards Life 3.0 series. My name is Mathias Risse, and I am the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I am welcoming you also on behalf of Sushma Raman, our executive director, who will join us at the Q&A stage. Our series, as many of you know, Towards Life 3.0 Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century has now been going on for a few years. The title of the series we take from Max Tegmark's book, Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And overall, the goal of the series is to explore ethical and human rights related issues that arise in the course of the technological innovation that is happening all around us and might eventually take us to a full-fledged Life 3.0, a phase of life populated by entities that get to design both of their culture, their software, so to speak, and their bodies, their hardware. Now, we do not know if that kind of life will ever emerge or when, but we also don't want to start thinking about its ethical dimensions only once it's clear that it will indeed emerge. And in any event, there are plenty of such challenges all around us already that occur as part of technological innovation at this stage in our history. Now, the Carr Center is, of course, not the only human rights center that has started to work at the intersection between human rights and technology. Far from it. In particular, the Human Rights Center at the University of California at Berkeley is also very much active in the space and in fact has beaten us to this domain by several years. One component of our sister center at Berkeley is the Human Rights Investigations Lab, which trains students, both undergraduate and graduate students, to use cutting-edge open source methodology to support human rights advocacy and accountability. In other words, that lab harnesses the abundant resources provided by the World Wide Web in support of human rights causes generally, and specifically in support of human rights investigation. So basically, what this means is there's a lot of material available on websites and on social media, and some of that is plainly fabricated, often by governments who want to give a certain story of how events happen and have the technological resources to actually present their version of things in the form of actual fabricated footage. But there's then also other material available someplace else on the web or on social media that helps set that record straight. And so here we very much need the right methods to find the materials that tell the actual story of the events that happened. In 2020, the center published the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations, which is offered as a practical guide on the effective use of digital open source information in investigating violations of international criminal, human rights, and humanitarian law. For open source information to be admissible as evidence in court, prosecutors and counsel must typically be able to establish its authenticity and chain of custody. And it is to that effect that certain standards of appropriate handling and processing are needed to make sure the material can actually be used by prosecutors and counsel. And so that's the kind of thing that the center has been very much working on, and that's now available to the broader public in this Berkeley protocol. And that takes me to our speaker for today. We are extremely fortunate to have with us today Dr. Alexa Koenig, who is the executive director of the Human Rights Center at Berkeley and the founder of the Human Rights Investigations Lab. Alexa is also a lecturer at the UC Berkeley School of Law, where she teaches classes in human rights and international criminal law, with a particular focus on the impact of emerging technologies on human rights practice. Alexa is a renowned and award-winning expert. In fact, Alexa is a bit of a superstar in this area, and the intersection between human rights, international law, and technology has done absolutely path-breaking work in this domain. And in fact, under her leadership, the Berkeley Human Rights Center won the 2015 MacArthur Award for creative and effective institutions based on the ways in which they apply cutting-edge science and research to protect human rights globally. Alexa is also a regular commentator on questions that arise on this nexus between human rights and technology, international law. And in that domain today, her topic is digital witnesses, ethical challenges in online human rights investigations. She will focus on some of the major ethical issues that arise when using online open source information for human rights accountability and the ethical code that is being developed in response. She will talk to us for about 25 minutes, and then the rest of the time we will devote to Q&A. Sushma and I will be back for that. You are also very much encouraged to use the YouTube channel to put your questions in. We'd like to have a bit of an interactive setting afterwards, and Alexa is very happy to respond to your questions. So we'd love to have audience involvement. So please do put your questions in the YouTube live stream. And with all that said, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Alexa Koenig.
Thank you, Dr. Risse, for that incredibly kind introduction, and also to both you and to Executive Director Sushma Raman for inviting me to join you this afternoon. I'm incredibly honored to have a chance to be part of this conversational series that you have, really looking at how new and emerging technologies are kind of changing human rights practice, or hopefully adding to it in ways that we find beneficial. So my topic today, I really want to focus on how we embrace new and emerging technologies, and especially social media content, to find facts about the world and to test the veracity of that information in ways that support a variety of different human rights objectives. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There's always that moment where you hope that this works seamlessly. Let me go ahead and present. And the particular focus, while this is coming up, as Dr. Risse mentioned, will really be on looking at an emerging area of ethical challenges with online open source investigations, and some of the ways that the broader online open source investigations community is beginning to respond to those challenges and create some kind of code of practice for us to help inform our decision-making around what to do at different stages of these investigations. I wanted to open with January 6, 2021, and the attacks on the US Capitol. I think that was a day that very much made salient how incredibly powerful photos and videos posted to social media can be for helping us better understand the facts underlying different social phenomena and helping to point to who may have been responsible for different kinds of wrongs around the world. There's been some really pioneering work done by a number of digital open source investigators in the space, identifying the different individuals who are involved in that particular event, and also helping to help law enforcement begin to pull together packages of information for later accountability. This, of course, builds on really important work that's been done in the human rights and international criminal legal space previously. Certainly, the Syrian conflict has been one really large example of how powerful videos can be for documenting human rights atrocities. Before that, and alongside that, of course, also genocide in Myanmar. So before I dive into this and get into the ethics piece, what are digital open source investigations? Well, digital open source investigations are investigations into alleged human rights atrocities and other world events that rely on open source information. In a nutshell, when I'm talking about open source information, I'm referring to information that's accessible on the internet that any member of the public can access by observation. So for example, putting in search terms in some kind of browser and finding the information they're looking for, by request, so requesting that information, or by purchase. And by purchase, we added that in the definition that we use at the Human Rights Center, predominantly because we wanted to be able to include things like New York Times articles and other media posts, as well as academic journals, where the price isn't so prohibitive that you can still consider it readily accessible by most members of the public who have an internet connection. Importantly, this can't be information that you need some special status to acquire. So you don't need to be a law enforcement officer, you don't need to be a lawyer or a judge. And it also doesn't include any information that you obtain through some form of illegal activity, like hacking into someone's database and extracting that information without that approval or permission. A little bit about our center, although I'm going to gloss over this quickly since we already discussed it. We have been around since 1994. We were really set up as a multidisciplinary hub on the UC Berkeley campus to bring together different researchers and innovators who are working on areas of mutual concern. So if there was a human rights or social justice question that was being asked that could be informed by people with very different backgrounds, whether journalism or law or computer science, this was a chance for them to come together outside of their disciplinary silos and begin to work on those problems collaboratively. In 2016, we launched our investigations lab. It is currently comprised of several staff headed by Stephanie Croft, who's our director, and about 60 students in any given semester. They come from usually 24 different disciplines, majors and minors, and may speak as many as 30 different languages and dialects among them, which really helps with the international nature of many of the investigations we're conducting in online spaces. We do this work for a range of different real-world partners. Those range from investigative reporters and other journalists to human rights advocacy groups. Amnesty International has been one of our most long-standing partners, and we were one of the original members of their Digital Verification Corps. That is a consortium of now 7 universities around the globe that are training a next generation to do this work. And then the third group are what we would consider legal accountability efforts. So everything from supporting organizations and individuals like the International Criminal Court to different United Nations commissions of inquiry, and then smaller human rights NGOs. I'm going to quickly show you a very quick video, if I can get it to run, which I think illustrates in some ways better than I can by just talking at you a little bit about who we are and what we do, but even more importantly, what an online open source investigation is and how we begin to approach those.
Egypt yesterday witnessed its strongest protest in probably 4 decades.
I was living in Egypt in 2011 when the revolution happened. I was really moved by the risks that I saw everyday citizens take to stand up to authority and to document abuses by the authority. I certainly struggled with guilt about leaving, and this question of how can I, from the sidelines, support the incredible activism and not just leave and never look back.
At the Human Rights Investigations Lab, we train students to comb through social media and other publicly accessible platforms on the internet to see if they can find evidence related to human rights abuses and to war crimes that are happening around the world. You'd be amazed how often videos are circulated and you're being told that this is actually Syria today, when maybe it came from Ethiopia 5 years ago. So a big piece of what our students are doing is really fact-checking.
This is Smart News Agency. They depend on citizens using their cell phones to go out and document what is going on in Syria. This appears to be the bombing of an aid convoy. Whenever I see cluster munitions, that is something we would be particularly interested in because those are illegal weapons in this conflict. The first thing I do is I look at when it was published, and I try to figure out if that's really the first time it was uploaded onto the internet. Turns out this video was uploaded for the first time here on YouTube on August 3rd. The other thing I start doing is translating and trying to figure out as much detail as possible. They claim that this attack happened towards the western entrance of this city. I'm going to go to satellite imagery now and start looking at the roads that are leading from El Atarib west.
So a lot of what you'll find, a lot of what I do is just like opening. When we do training for digital verification, a lot of people come along and think there's a silver bullet for verification, and actually there's not. Probably the trickiest part of the whole verification techniques we use is trying to work out exactly where a photograph or video is actually taken or captured or filmed. But often it's the most important thing we can do.
So the goal is to make sure that video is saved and that we analyze as much information as possible from this video so that hopefully it can be used in a legal investigation or one day in a case seeking legal accountability for this attack.
To be able to have the people who are already there sending information out, either through videos that they post to YouTube or videos that they post to Facebook, that means we're hearing stories we've never actually heard before and wouldn't have otherwise.
One group that we're working with is the Syrian Archive. We'll see if we get them the first try.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Hi.
Hey, honey.
We have about 600 videos only related to chemical weapons attacks, but they are not analyzed. What you are doing is the most important, is analyzing and doing open source investigation, which we really don't have the capacity to do right now.
So I've gone back to work on one of the convoy videos. I'm having a really hard time really geolocating it, partly because it's on just a big rural road.
Just send me the materials and we can work on it together.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hadi. I really appreciate this.
Welcome.
We all really love working on your projects. They give us a lot of meaning in our life, so thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you guys so much.
I have probably found some coordinates that are where the bombing for those trucks took place on August 3rd, 2016. There's this really interesting moment of excitement when you think you've really found it. And there's a part of me that is absolutely yearning for a lot more accountability and waiting to see what happens with this information. If you're going after the president of a country or a commanding general, the last thing you want is these cases falling apart. Our students go through the painstaking work of verifying so that courts and human rights investigators knew how much they could rely on that information and ultimately get those stories out to the world.
What I hope for Andrea and for any of the students to take with them is just the skills that they've gained, that they're able to disseminate that through work that they do for better social good.
The students who come out of this are going to be part of a pipeline that's never really existed before. And the potential for them to help various fields of practice is enormous. It's actually with this work that I've kind of gotten rid of a lot of that guilt. This work allows me to feel like I can directly give something back to the activists who take so much risk to document these human rights violations.
So I wanted to show that video mostly because I think it puts a more human face on some of the work that we've been doing in the center. The number one thing that I want to underscore as we kind of pivot into the conversation around ethics is just what a collaborative area of practice it is. Certainly our team has learned so much from others who've been pioneers in the space, whether it's groups like Amnesty International, who have done some really incredible work around how to bring communities together to work on these problems collectively. Also groups like Bellingcat, who of course have done some amazing research into different world phenomena. And then also other groups that are smaller that I think often don't get the attention that they deserve. Certainly we've learned also from our students. One of the ways that we began asking the question of what are the areas of this ethics of practice came when we taught our first class in, I think it was spring of 2017 for a cohort of law students. That particular class was really focused on how can we get the legal sector embracing some of these extraordinary methods that have been pioneered at places like Storyful and at Bellingcat and that others had increasingly taken on in terms of really harnessing the large quantities of information that go up on social media each day and really using that to the advantage of figuring out what is going on in the world. Our work had actually come at this from a very different angle before intersecting with that area of practice. We had begun looking in 2011 at the upcoming 10-year anniversary of the International Criminal Court and asking a question like many others in the space about what the court's track record looked like to date. At that point, a number of really high-profile cases had fallen apart at relatively early stages of prosecution. And the question we were asking was why, when there's so much global attention, is this happening? And our research essentially uncovered, as is now really broadly known, that what the judges were saying was a primary problem was that the prosecution was perhaps over-relying on the stories of survivors without bringing in the corroborating information that was needed to meet the evidentiary threshold to get these cases through to a successful completion. And so the question we began asking in concert with others was, what other kinds of information exist out there that can shore up what we are hearing from the survivors about what's been happening in their communities? So we began looking at who was pioneering new technologies in remote sensing, satellite imagery, of course, being one form of remote sensing, in big data analytics, the emergence of artificial intelligence-based technologies. Also in terms of harnessing the smartphone, certainly our colleagues at Witness and Vedere Credere have done great work about training people on the ground to better capture on their smartphones the kinds of information that can best support justice and accountability efforts downstream. We also began working with the International Criminal Court to help them begin to build up their own workflows and work processes to be able to integrate this information. And of course, the majority of the work was done by them. I think that a lot of what we contributed to the space, hopefully, was bringing a number of people into conversation with each other who weren't already. And these reports are some of the reports that we produced on the basis of that work. Since then, though, we have also pivoted beyond just the legal accountability question. We have a longstanding relationship with journalists and have been really exploring how this kind of information, how we can lend capacity to reporters who maybe either don't have the methodological expertise to do digital open source investigations of phenomena, or do have the expertise but need more bodies because there's breaking news and they need all hands on deck, or else need sort of the language expertise to be able to comb social media and different platforms in ways that can be as efficient and effective as possible. And so these are just a few of the stories that we've worked on recently, looking at the use of forced labor to make PPE for the American markets with the New York Times, and of course, documenting hate speech promulgated over the Facebook platform in the context of the genocide in Myanmar. Our most recent report came out as a partnership with Insecurity Insight. We had a team at the Human Rights Center led by Stephanie Croft and Rohini Har that looked at over 1,100 attacks on healthcare workers and healthcare facilities. Over 400 of those were found to be directly related to the COVID pandemic. Much of this work is really made possible because of the shifting and changing nature of how people communicate. One thing we were really noticing, particularly in the legal space, was how much people relied on traditional forms of fact-finding. The gold standard for any investigation is to bring together testimonies, what survivors say, with physical information like the chemical soil samples and the murder weapons, et cetera, with then the documentary information like the signed contracts and the written orders. And you pull those together to see if they point you in the same direction around the who, what, when, where, why, and how of what happened. Or if they potentially point in very different directions and even further investigation is needed. A lot of the work that we're doing now, of course, comes from the digital revolution of the 50s to 70s and what's made possible in terms of the increased ways and variety of ways that we all communicate. One other thing that I want to underscore before we get into the ethical frameworks that we've begun to use in the context of our practice is there's a really phenomenal piece done by the New York Times that if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. It was an exploration that they did into the potential igniting of an aid convoy in Venezuela that was originally alleged to have been perpetrated by then President Maduro's forces. It turns out, according to the New York Times investigation, that actually Maduro was likely not responsible for the aid convoy. But by the time that reporting came out, the idea that this had been caused by Maduro had been picked up by several members of the US government. It had been promulgated across media, and it had begun to infect international law and policy. I think it's a really great overview of just how rife our information ecosystem can be with mis and disinformation. Many of our traditional methods of fact-finding and verification, I think many who grew up in my generation or before, we were really told to look to authoritative figures to know the truth of what had happened. I think in an increasingly digital world, that is not enough and may not have been enough even then. And so I think an increasing need is for really sharing some of the methods that online open source investigators use to verify facts that are found online to help improve the information that's flowing across digital space. As part of that collective effort to begin to lay some kind of understanding for what is needed to advance digital open source investigations, particularly in the legal sector, our team worked very closely with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to bring together a community to look at what basically had become sort of the norms in that area of practice, and what were the basic principles that we should all be developing to ensure that the quality of the investigations that we're conducting are as high as possible, that they adhere to ethical norms and standards that are emerging in the space, and are done to minimize harms and maximize the benefits of what we can do with digital information. We built it off of the previous protocols that had been established, including the Istanbul Protocol on Torture and the Minnesota Protocol on how to document unlawful deaths. And a big thanks to Lindsay Freeman, who helped to lead a lot of the 150 consultations that we did and the workshops we pulled together to begin to explore areas where the consensus was not yet clear. There were several principles that emerged from those conversations that I think do tie directly to the question of what is ethical practice with these investigations. We bucketed them as professional principles. Those are the principles that really point to who is the person doing the investigation, including their needs for competency and objectivity in terms of what they produce. Methodological principles that really get at what are the tools and methods that we use, and how should we be setting up our investigations from the outset to minimize the risks. And then third, what are the ethical principles that we should be building into our investigations to think about the how we do these going forward. So to look for a few minutes at what new ethical challenges do these investigations raise, a lot of what many of us began to do in having workshops and conversations, and I want to do a quick shout out to the University of Essex Human Rights, Big Data and Technology program, who co-hosted some of these workshops with us, is we began to look at what Sam Dubberly, our colleague at Amnesty, was calling the mistakes and near misses in the space. One great example is that of the bombing in Boston at the Boston Marathon in 2013. In that case, there was an effort to use social media and crowdsourcing to figure out who was behind that particular bomb attack. And unfortunately, initially, a video that had been posted online of a gentleman named Sunil Tripathi. He had gone missing a month previously, and his family had put up some visual information to see if people knew his whereabouts. Well, that information was grabbed by citizen investigators who felt that he had a resemblance to some of what you could see in relatively grainy footage of the bombing itself. And unfortunately, he was for a while being talked about in digital open spaces as a likely candidate for having conducted that attack. I think it's a really great reminder of the risks of misidentification of perpetrators in the space and the ripple effects that can happen in terms of their lives and the lives of their families when someone is wrongly accused. A second example that I think has come up frequently in digital open source investigation circles is Europol's Stop Child Abuse Trace and Object project, whereby they tried to crowdsource information about potential trafficking of children and abuse of children by posting objects that may have been with that child, for example, and seeing if people can help them begin to narrow in on where and when something may have taken place that was of risk to these kids. Unfortunately, there have been some incidents where the background was where a child might have been whited out from a particular image, but the background was there. And the idea was to help geolocate or identify where the location was. Unfortunately, with technology today, it's so easy to do what's called a reverse image search of a photo that it's easy to find the original. And again, potentially expose a young child victim and their identity to a broader array of audiences when using some of these methods. I think there's been some really great thinking that's gone in as a result about how can we really harness the power of large quantities of people and the reach of social media to basically protect people and point investigators in the right direction when needed. And as a result of this, I'll just point back to this, Europol now has a request that people not post anything to public spaces on social media when helping to support these investigations going forward. The last piece I really want to point out is this idea of the new first responders. So one big challenge we had when first working with this content is that you're dealing with very raw, unedited content. Photographers used to be the people who would go into areas of conflict, take photos, and had a strict ethical code about how to photograph these atrocities in ways that maximize dignity for the deceased, for the others that are harmed, and they were usually very curated and packaged. Today, we're being bombarded with lots of what's called user-generated content. So the raw materials put up on social media by people in the moment and in the heat of the moment. It's often very unedited. It's often very emotive, and with good reason. People are trying to draw attention to things in ways that will emotionally hook external audiences for good reason. But as has been found repeatedly, being bombarded with that kind of raw content at the quantity that we may have exposure to it today can be really difficult on the investigator, him or herself. I remember at one point being visited by someone in the broader international human rights community who said, Alexa, the great thing about these digital open source investigations is at least no one's getting hurt, versus those of us who go on the ground where your physical risks are often quite high. And I remember responding, yes, of course that's true. But I think there is a real danger of miscalculating the risks that can come psychologically and socially from this kind of work. And if any of you haven't seen this piece by Casey Newton, The Trauma Floor, I think it really does make quite visceral just how damaging being bombarded with so much horrific information can be for the people who are facing it. So questions we've grappled with in practice, and I'll try and keep my comments to about 5 more minutes so we can open it up to questions from all of you and stuff that we struggled with in our lab. I'd love to pose these to you and have you think maybe about what you would do in these instances. So would you use information from a database that the owner thought was private, but you found online in public space? That was one of the first ethical quandaries we had, where we were doing an investigation. We found a spreadsheet. They had obviously set their permissions to public facing without realizing it, or had a default. And we had long list of personally identifiable information about people who were giving up information sensitive to some really gruesome attacks. Now, this had the people's names and contact information, and it was information that was very potentially helpful to our investigation. And we really did grapple with the question of, should we alert this particular person? What are the harms of not alerting that individual? And should we even consider using this information going forward? Another one, would you set up a fake name or account to get information or access to a closed group on, say, Facebook or some other social media site? There are legal ramifications to doing that. Certainly, if you join a closed group, you could be held criminally liable for a criminal conspiracy if that group is later found to be responsible for a group crime. I think there are a lot of questions that have been raised about, well, who are you to be doing this? Is this an invasion of privacy? For those of us who work in human rights, that's a pretty serious question, since there is this notion that privacy should be protected under the human rights framework. And alongside that, would you go through a target's family members and their friends to get information about them? That's obviously a very common practice. And I'm not saying that that is inherently unethical, but there may be limits on the ethics of that work. And then finally, would you crowdsource information via social media and share back and forth who's the likely perpetrator of an event? Knowing that getting that wrong can have such extreme consequences. If you do that practice, what are some things that you can do to mitigate the potential harms, and thinking that through from the outset? Ultimately, when we're talking about ethics, some of the reasons why we feel it's so important to come together as a community of practice and have these conversations is, first, the ability to minimize harms. So the more we can share with each other, here's what we are all learning, and here's what we think can help minimize those harms, the more we can all move forward together. It also plays a really important role in establishing the parameters around this area of practice. I know there's been at least one philosopher who has suggested that it's actually ethics that defines the parameters of a profession, because it suggests what is inside the norms of those profession and what's outside of it. It also, of course, clarifies our values as an area of practice. And then finally, it's helpful from a very utilitarian sense in terms of addressing practical normative challenges that may address in this space. When we were grappling with this, one of the first things we did was look to see if there was an OSINT code of ethics, and we couldn't find anything. What little we saw was really focused on whether the ethics of reusing someone's user-generated content in your own reporting. It was very focused on IP rights and rights of authorship. But that didn't seem to really address many of the challenges that we were facing. So we looked at legal ethics, we looked at the ethics of journalists, and we looked at the ethics of social science research and began to pull the pieces together that really seemed to reflect the kinds of work in this area. What we ultimately came up with, and I have to credit a broad community for this framework, was looking at a three-pronged approach. When we brought legal investigators together with journalists doing open source investigations, we found that there were many areas in which their understanding of ethical practice did not align, largely because the kinds of outputs they were producing were very different. But these were the three pieces on which there was some consensus. And there was a kind of a slogan that emerged from the space: be kind, be safe, be true. That for purposes of our own internal work at the lab and in the protocol, we rephrased as security, dignity, and accuracy. And I won't go too much into each, just given the sake of time, but when it comes to security, from the very first months of our lab, we realized it was really important to think about security holistically, as physical security, digital security, and the psychosocial security and well-being, not only of our investigations team, but of the general public and the people who may be impacted by the investigation itself. In terms of the security, we also were asking the question, whose security? A big piece of the protocol is underscoring the need for investigations planning before conducting these investigations and really beginning to map who are the potential people that might be harmed and how. A lot of times when we're talking about the security of our own team, what we're thinking about is not just our investigators, but their family members. Our team is incredibly international, and sometimes the people working on the investigations come directly from the countries that we are investigating. Many of them have family members back in those countries. So thinking through how we best safeguard them and their work. A quote that I love and that we rely on frequently, and a shout out to Andrea Lampros on our team, who's our resiliency manager, really focused on the psychological piece. There's a lot of war crimes investigators and others who will gladly embrace the need for more digital and physical security preparation, but the psychological is often undercounted. And the quote says, "This expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet." A lot of times the ethos historically in the human rights investigation space has been, you either can hack it, this kind of work, or you can't and you get out. But I think there's a growing understanding that it's not just about the individual. It's also about the structures we put in place to support each other, the cultures that we develop within our organizations that have a huge bearing on who is able to do this for the long haul. Certainly for ourselves, we have a no questions asked policy that someone can step out of an investigation at any time. Also, it may not be until you're deep in the weeds of an investigation that you realize its impact. So I think there's a lot more work and exciting work that's being done by Meg Satterthwaite, Sarah Nucky, Adam Brown, Sam Dubberly, and others, as well as Andrea Lampros on our team, to think through how we can work better with organizations to set people up to do this work for the long haul. There are, of course, tips and tricks that many people already use in the space, like minimizing the sound. So much of the emotion comes from the mother pleading for her child or the person pleading for their life. Awareness of how we're being impacted, and ultimately the power of knowing the impact you're having with these investigations and the community that you're a part of that has been found to have a very protective effect. Finally, dignity. So the next piece is really looking at how do we think about whose voices should be heard, who should be doing these investigations, how do we make sure that's as broad as possible? It gets down to how we show and demonstrate the death of somebody. I think that there's been recent examples of showing what we can do to get someone's death from all different angles and putting that up online. Is that necessarily the most dignified way, even if they're a perpetrator, to show their demise? What about their family members who may see it? And what about the general public who may be impacted by that visual information? Also crediting. we have a piece coming out, or I have a piece coming out soon with 2 colleagues that says that open source research has the potential to profoundly affect not just whose stories get told, but also who gets to tell those stories and who will listen to them. So thinking more about the positionality of the investigations themselves, and how do we begin to diversify who has the training in this space and disseminate this across regions of the world so that stories get as close to the source as they can when that is appropriate, and that there are great deep partnerships that can come out from these collaborations. Libby McAvoy has a great piece that came out recently where she talks about the need to center the source in open source investigation and really think a little bit more critically about how we begin to do that. And then finally, accuracy. How do we make sure that the people doing this work, since so many of the tools are really broadly accessible, have the competency to do it, that they're able to maintain objectivity with the known biases that there are in the world around machine biases, if we're using artificial intelligence or machine learning based technologies to find and source this information in the first place, and also the very human biases that we can bring to this space. One of the things we've really been trying to work on, at least within our own team, and is I think a cornerstone of the work that we've done historically, is thinking through how we can learn from scientific principles to help mitigate some of the human fallibilities that currently exist. This is everything from developing multiple working hypotheses and investigating those hypotheses, proving the null hypothesis, and making sure that we engage in peer review of each other's work. Finally, to mitigate some of the human bias, having a protocol in place, almost like a checklist, can help to be a counter for some of this work. I'll just kind of close on the last, if anyone wants to look further into this, we do touch on ethics in the Berkeley Protocol. Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner, recently said about this, that it is about protecting human rights and advancing justice, and particularly welcoming its principles of humility, inclusivity, and dignity. I think the online open source community has done an extraordinary job over the last decade in building up what we can do. I think the next challenge for us as a community of practice is figuring out not only what can we do, but how we can do it and how we should be doing it going forward. So I'll give the last word to Zara Rahman and Gabby Ivins, who I think have put a lot of thought and care into this, and sort of their overriding principle as they write in Digital Witness, that just because you can do this doesn't mean you should. I think it's that should that we all get to explore further in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexa, for your work in this space, for your leadership, and for being part of our program today with Mathias and the Carr Center. So I'm going to get us started with the conversation portion of today's session. And I'm wondering if you can respond to a question from the audience. With so many videos uploaded to the internet every day, how do you decide what videos to look at and fact check? And I would add to that to say that there is misinformation and disinformation through these viral videos. So how are you able to verify the authenticity and accuracy, veracity of these sources?
That's an excellent question. I think one of the challenges early on is, of course, a lot of our partners have sometimes collected thousands, if not more than 1 million videos of a particular atrocity or series of events. What we discovered early on, as many others have, is the need to figure out, if possible, the original video. There's so much duplication across social spaces. Can we get back to the original? And that helps with the quality of the investigation by helping with fact checking, but it also ensures that we have more contextual information about not only the source of that video, but how that information has flowed across platforms. In addition, I think it really also is incumbent on us to ask very careful questions at the outset of an online open source investigation, and writing up in our investigations plan the parameters of what we're trying to accomplish in collaboration with our partners. I do think there is also the risk of the videos that we don't see and that we don't readily find. So much, as we know, of videos that go up about atrocities are really visual. The reason the video has gone up is because the event is very visual. I'm working on a study with a colleague Egan looking at sexual violence crimes and how online open source information can help better support those kinds of crimes, which are already so difficult to prosecute, given that I think there's a real fear among more traditional investigators in the space that this move towards digital open source investigations is going to make those kinds of investigations even harder, as judges increasingly expect videos and photographs to be there to corroborate what survivors are saying, which is going to potentially bias our investigations in favor of things like mass bombings, hospital attacks, things like that, that are very readily captured by large numbers of people.
Thank you, Alexa. So I'd like to ask you one thing about the ethics part, the transition from these various case studies and scenarios that you had to the triangular representation there of dignity, security, accuracy, because I thought there was one thing that struck me as that needed to belong to an analysis of these various scenarios that was missing in that triangle, namely. So let's take the case about what do you do about a scenario where somebody was under the impression that this particular bit of information was private, right? They made some kind of mistake there. Or also the other one, are you allowed to engage people with a fake name? Is this okay? So one thing that pops to my mind, as scenarios like that come up is, I would ask, what kind of complaints would people have here, right? If you do these things, right? Who could complain, and what's the rationale for the complaint? And as you think about that, the complaints are more or less legitimate. I mean, that is always depending on what else is happening, right? So what else is at stake? And so, for example, this issue about the privacy settings, somebody was assuming this was private information. Can we take it? Well, it depends on at least two things: how much is at stake for them if this comes out, right? But also, how much is at stake for the people who would benefit from this information, So in a way, a kind of magnitude dimension. And I do not mean this in a utilitarian sense, because that would just be kind of summing up different blocks here, but it's really, the legitimacy of complaints turns on the magnitude of concerns. And somehow that aspect of it wasn't really there anymore when, this triangular structure by itself, I think, is very plausible, because it also captures the trade-offs that one may have to make along different dimensions. But somehow this magnitude issue in terms of weightiness of complaint doesn't seem to be present anymore in this triangular representation.
So definitely, so that's an excellent point. I think one thing that I would say is that in the end of the protocol, we provide a series of annexes that really help provide a template for investigation planning, including doing some basic threat modeling. So I think the threat modeling process really looks at what are the potential risks and harms, what are the vulnerabilities of the organization or for the investigation, and what are some ways to mitigate those risks and harms. So I think that part of the process really begins to get at the scale of harm that might happen and how that might go into a calculation around what are the trade-offs and what are the reasonable outcomes in this particular case. I think the triangle is really trying to get at a bare minimum, as we're going through that process, let's be thinking about this in terms of the security, the physical security, who could be physically harmed. In the case of the spreadsheet, I think the concern there was that the list of people who, their names, their address, their contact information, et cetera, these were people who'd given up information on a really notorious perpetrator. So if we use that investigation, there's an ethos of transparency in digital open source investigations, which is phenomenal, because I think when you've got methodological transparency, it allows people to try to replicate your process and see if they can to check the quality of your work. But there is a limit to transparency and its benefit, I think, in the space when you're talking about people who may be made even more vulnerable by your methodological transparency. For example, we had one project we were working on. It was an attack in Syria, and we geolocated the location. So we figured out the coordinates of the location where the person who shot the video likely stood. But we realized this was likely that particular person's home. And if we were, the first draft of the report actually had, here's what we did. We geolocated the coordinates of the person who shot the video so we can check the angle of the attack. But by putting that out publicly, we would, of course, potentially be exposing that person in a country that's currently hit by conflict, where he would be made potentially more vulnerable. So I think those are the kinds of everyday practices that we're struggling with. And by creating the security versus dignity versus accuracy framework, it does help us to think through a little more methodically, I think, what some of those trade-offs may be. I have been told by other ethicists in the place, and I am not an ethicist by practice, so I know that myself and several of the colleagues I'm working with really welcome other approaches and ways of thinking about these things that we may not have already grappled with. But one thing he's been saying is what we're missing is a motivator. What actually compels you to act? A lot of what he's hearing from the emerging framework from online open source investigators are reasons not to act and not to put information out. And I think that's in part because of this ethos of transparency that we have.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to follow up on a point you had made earlier where you talked about who gets to tell the stories. And I'm wondering if you can share a bit about how you train people outside of academia to use these kinds of tools to promote justice and accountability in their own communities. And the other part of my question is really one that is drawing on like the accountability of the institutions that are involved in these efforts. So I think, when we think of governments, they're accountable to their citizens. And if you think of institutions of global governance or international institutions, there's a certain framework within which they operate. But in this ecosystem of civil society organizations that you're collaborating with across countries, many of which are embedded in local politics and perspectives, how do you ensure impartiality and accountability and even address some of the challenges and misconceptions of human rights organizations having certain political or biased agendas?
That's a great question. I think who gets to tell the stories to start? One of the things that we've really been focused on is figuring out how we provide trainings, oftentimes for free, to individuals who are doing this work on the ground in human rights contexts in very different parts of the world. To support that, we have a partnership with the Institute for International Criminal Investigations to provide paid training to professional war crimes investigators and others. And we certainly do ad hoc paid investigations for different constituencies, whether they're journalists or others. But a lot of times we do get foundation grants to try and increase capacity. I think ideally what we would love to see going forward, and Amnesty's Digital Verification Core, I think, is one step in that right direction, is to create hubs of knowledge in different regions of the world. These are basic skills that everyone should have: how to find information online, how to check its accuracy, how to know what to share and what not to share. So I think that training needs to happen and I think should be further supported. The protocol will be launched in all of the languages of the United Nations starting late spring, early summer. We're hoping that that will provide at least one resource for local communities that speak different languages to begin to integrate some of these thinkings and lessons learned. But at the same time, that's going to have to be adapted to the very local context in which they're working. And I think, one thing that I think was really helpful about the development of the protocol was our colleague Lindsay Freeman was based at the International Criminal Court and had a chance, as we drafted portions of it, to test it against real world investigations and bring those insights back into the protocol itself. Meanwhile, we were also doing that in our investigations lab. That then has a chance to inform standard operating practices and procedures that different groups can utilize then at the national level or among human rights investigations teams. The who gets to tell the stories, I do think there's a real push right now, as Libby McAvoy said, to try and recenter the source of open source investigations. Sometimes it's not safe for people to tell their own stories, depending on the context in which they're operating. That's where these partnerships with people outside the region can be extremely valuable. But at that point, I think it also gets to who gets credit for those investigations. We had a big wake-up call at one point in our lab where a team of students had spent like a year working on a particular investigation. And when the report came out, it named the partners and it named the Human Rights Center, but not the individual investigators. And these were young adults who were trying to build their own careers. They often came from a diversity of countries. Most of them were students of color. And they, what we didn't want to create was really a system that again, relied on the backs of people doing this work, which is so time consuming, and then giving the credit to people in very elite positions of power. And so I think that's one area where it's been such a luxury to work with students, is many of the gains that we've made on the dignity front and the respect for each other front has come from their insights around how we can be more egalitarian in the approach. And I do think there's a narrative right now in the space about who is an open source investigator. It's kind of like this Wild West notion, a cowboy who's out there, or cowgirl. And more, I think what we need to realize is that this is something that belongs to a much broader array of people than maybe do get that crediting. The impartiality piece, maybe I'll just end answering your question on that. I do think that's where one thing we do is we partner up investigators. So for example, we might have someone doing an investigation who's from Syria or has family from Syria who maybe speaks the languages or maybe has kind of an easier time doing portions of the investigation, but then have another student who can challenge their work. And that's where things like having multiple working hypotheses and testing that against the evidence becomes helpful. Or trying to prove the null hypothesis. If we think this is X mosque in Syria, can we prove that it's not? And if so, how? Those basic principles, I think, are something that we try and bring increasingly into the space. And then last, I think on the point you made about human rights organizations often being perceived as being biased, I'm sure, we all, of course, have biases, but that's where the transparency of methodology really becomes helpful. The idea, and I think Bellingcat has really done a great job of putting this out there, is, all right, here's all of our methods. You don't believe us, check it out for yourself. And that is why the empowering of people to really know how to check it out for themselves is so important.
Yes, one question from audience member Bob Wyman. Bob is asking, where did it go? If you know that a video is fake, do you have an obligation to publicize that fact?
That is interesting. I'm trying to think of a fact pattern where the answer would be no, because I do think that in most situations, I think, again, I would try and go through the basic steps that we've created for our internal practices to go, all right, is someone going to be harmed by this? If so, whom? Looking at what the context is around that particular video. I'd also ask the context of who am I as the investigator? Am I working on a legal investigation? How have I come across this information? Am I hurting the investigation or hurting other individuals by revealing that this is fake? My guess is the majority of the time, though, there will likely be some sort of obligation to be truthful. I think this gets at the accuracy piece. And whether someone would be harmed by not knowing that it's fake, and kind of bringing that all together.
So thank you so much. This was fascinating. I think, we've understood a little bit more about how your lab works and how open source investigations works. I'm wondering, for those of us who are watching and who are not deeply embedded in this work, what are ways in which we can verify information or articles, and are there resources or organizations you suggest we look more into?
Absolutely. So Digital Witness is the book that I put together with two colleagues. It's the first textbook on digital open source investigations. I love that book because it has over 18 different contributors to it who are some of the best at what they do. Eric Toller of Bellingcat wrote our chapter on verification. Paul Myers wrote the chapter on search. Zara Rahman and Gabby Ivins wrote the chapter on ethics. There's some really fascinating conversations in there around the positionality of the investigator and how he or she relates to the particular incident that I think are important to grapple with. But also Craig Silverman's Verification Handbook. It was written for journalists, but it has some really great overviews. It's just some basic ways to think about digital information to act as a check. It's available for free as a PDF online, and it's been translated into a number of different languages. So again, a great resource. One of my all-time favorite books is Data Feminism. I think that just came out in the past year. I think that challenged my way of thinking about the crediting of people and how we present facts and information in ways that I really needed to think through and grapple with, and I'm still grappling with, to be honest, because I do think they help to lay out a perspective on the future of sharing information in ways that are important, and how very innocuous framing can really shift people's perceptions of information in ways that are profoundly important. Bellingcat has great trainings, and of course IICI has great trainings as well, and I would recommend any of those. Oh, and then a free resource from Amnesty International. They just put up a 3-hour training that any person can do that will introduce you to the basics of how to verify this kind of online content. So definitely want to plug that one as well.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Alexa, for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for being part of this conversation series with us. We'll be back again next week. We'll be hearing from our former Carr Center Technology and Human Rights Fellow, Lauren Leonard. She'll be talking about the work that she and her mother, Teresa Hodge, have done to address the needs of individuals who are coming out of the criminal justice system and tackling issues of algorithmic bias in the criminal justice system. So look forward to having you with us the coming weeks. We also will be hearing from Shoshana Zuboff, author of Surveillance Capitalism, in a couple of weeks. So check out our newsletter, our website, and our social media feed. Thank you all for joining. And thank you again, Alexa.